morning, everyone. You hear me. It's good. Well, I wish you successful. Yes. Uh-huh. 1 minute before, it was no one. Okay, we wait. Sanya. Does it have to do with Zoom? Is this on? Yes. Ah.
I'll have to do it from here.
It's a bit strange.
Could you change the slides for me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, let's start. Well, I wish you happy third day of the conference and successful in presentations and listening. And I would now announce our third keynote speaker. And we have an honor, I think, of having Gary McPherson as a keynote here. He's probably the most productive author in the interdisciplinary field of music education and psychology of music. And he's currently an Ormond professor of music at the Melbourne Conservatory of Music and has served as the national president of the Australian Society for Music Education and president of the International Society for Music Education, of which he is an honorary life member. So his keynote today covers his main research interests. So let's hear about that.
Perfect.
After we were reading a lot.
Good. Thanks, everyone. It's such a great pleasure to be here. Thank you. We had all of this worked out. I had my clicker working and everything. For some reason, it's just stopped. So I'm going to get my wonderful colleague to sort of change the slides for me. And can I just begin by thanking everyone who's made this trip possible for me. I've never been to Croatia or this part of the world before, so it's a real honour to be here, and it's just been a wonderful, wonderful week. Amazing hosts, thank you so much. Now, as you can see from this face, this is an old guy. I've been around for a little while, okay? I did my PhD. I taught in schools. I was a trumpet player, professional trumpet player for a while. But I came into academia and did my PhD when I was in my mid-30s. So I'd had a lot of experience as a professional musician plus a teacher before then. And so I'll begin with a little bit of an explanation of my thinking around the time, the end of the 1980s, the early 1990s, when I was starting to think about my PhD, and I'll compare and contrast some of the stuff that was out there at the time with what I was exposed to and what I was thinking, what I was trying to plan to do. So I go to the next slide. And we can talk about skill versus will. We can look at skill development in terms of how students progress. Do they get better at sight reading, performing pieces that they're learning from their books? Can they improvise, etc. So things that we can see, observe here in terms of their skill development. And skill development, we often think that it's stepwise. You know, if a child's learning for another 6 months, they're going to be better. Well, not necessarily, and I'll show you some results in a moment that we'll really contradict that. But you know, the common conception of skill is that with experience and with practice, we just get better and better and better at things. So we'll talk about that in a moment. But in 1993, I was very much exposed to the thinking in music psychology of the time with this amazing contribution by Kay Anders Ericsson. It really is a landmark publication, a wonderful, wonderful publication. And, he talked about accumulated practice, deliberate practice. That was the theoretical framework for that article. He says that the goal is to improve your performance, so you're thinking about what you're doing when you're practicing, and it's very goal-oriented. It's effortful. You put in a lot of effort. You need to be motivated. It needs to be purposeful. Needs to be systematic. And that famous diagram there, or figure there, with the 10,000 hours of practice for the experts as compared to the couple of thousand hours of practice for the amateurs. 5 times difference. And that was done with pianists at the Warsaw Academy, I think. So it's got about 16,000 citations. You could look at that every day on Google Scholar, and you can see it click over. So you dream of that sort of article, and he had one of them, so good on him. Okay, so next slide. But, not only have I been interested in skill development, but I've really been interested in motivation, this willingness, this desire to sit down and practice, particularly with young children. Where it's very, very complex, and getting kids really wrapped up in music so that they want to learn music, they want to spend time practicing by themselves at home and acquiring better skills. That's really been something that I've always been interested in. In fact, the overriding some conception for me, that the single question that I've always thought about and tried to explain is, how does a child, when they start learning, say, trumpet, think of themselves as, I'm learning trumpet, to I'm a trumpet player. That transition, which I think is a really interesting way of thinking about it. They start to feel the trumpet as part of them, it's part of their identity, etc., rather than I'm just learning that as I'm learning mathematics at school, etc. Yeah. And we can look at, the combination of those. Ideally, we want students to be highly skilled and very, very motivated, that top right-hand quadrant there. But most of the kids that we teach in the first few years, they're somewhere in those other 3 quadrants. So, but the aim is to try and get them to the top right-hand corner. Now, I did a PhD at Sydney University in educational psychology, and at the time it was a fabulous department, had some world experts there, including this guy, Ray Debus, and he had a profound effect on my thinking. I did a year of educational psychology with Ray. It was a motivation course. It was an extremely difficult course, but he was like a walking encyclopedia of what was happening in motivation at that particular time. So it was a real pleasure to work with him. But, I was contrasting, I say that because I'd like to contrast the thinking in educational psychology, which was really about motivation, as compared to psychology, which was really about talent and skill development, and at that time, deliberate practice. So I was exposed through Ray to Barry Zimmerman, and I've written a couple of chapters with Barry. I've never met him. That's the greatest shame I have in my professional life, that I've never had a chance to sit down and have a coffee with him or a drink with him, but we've written some work together, and I've communicated over 30 years with this guy. He's got 160,000 citations. Just this year alone, he's got well over 7,400 citations. You can see like 40 or 50 a day. Now, he hasn't been working because he's been very, very sick. He retired about 12 years ago, so he hasn't really published much or if anything in the last 10 or 12 years, but still an amazing influence and an amazing impact. And he was the father of self-regulated learning, which has, obviously had a profound impact on educational psychology. Now, when I was working with Ray and doing that motivation course, I remember we had to do this 10,000-word essay on motivation, and he chose one chapter as the catalyst for us to critique and have a think about and offer our views and translate those ideas into our home discipline. So I had to translate those ideas into music. Now, it was Carol Ames, who was a motivation expert at the time. She was working at the University of Michigan, and she was churning out these amazing studies. But she wrote this chapter called Effective Motivation, the Contribution of the Learning Environment. And I remember reading that chapter, and in particular, this sentence, or these 2 sentences, and this changed my life. Positive motivation is more than the demonstration of effortful activity or even time spent on a task. It's more than just deliberate practice. It is reflected in how students think about themselves, the task, and their performance, those three other components. And those three other components are what have shaped my thinking and my research ever since reading that in about 1990 or so when I was doing the study. Okay, so again, just to recap, we can look at deliberate practice. Well, my orientation was self-regulated learning, and self-regulated learning in order to look at skill development, particularly in young children, and then later on with experts, and self-determination theory to look at motivation. I came onto self-determination theory when people were starting to think about this in music and other disciplines beyond the academic subjects about 2004, 2005. Okay, another influence for me is James Mannering, and hardly anyone knows this guy, but he wrote some of the most eloquent and powerful articles that I've ever read. They were published in the British Journal of Psychology, and so he was a very, very early music educator, but also music psychologist, and he did a lot of experimental studies. But he talked about the importance of being able to speak the language of music, that is being able to play by ear. He really stressed the need for students when they're learning an instrument to start with ear-hand coordination skills and playing by ear before then, being introduced to traditional music notation. So he says the ability to read music should be superimposed on this ability so that students learn to think in sound. Now, if you know any of the literature in music education in the 70s and 80s, Peter Webster, John Crowdis, all these other Americans were talking about, the ability to think in sound, creativity, all that sort of stuff. You can go back 60 years or 50 years and you can see that this guy was actually talking about it and had done studies in it. It was just sort of lost in the literature, but I do hope that, music educators get back into that because they're some of the best things that I've ever read. Okay, so my PhD was about skill development, and I looked at 5 different types of skills for children: improvising, making music up, a visual orientation where children are sight reading music for the first time, or, this is the term I invented because I couldn't find any other term, performing rehearsed music, which is the traditional approach of learning the pieces from the method book or the books that they're learning, and they rehearse a piece over a number of weeks before they've mastered it and then perform it. The oral orientation is playing by ear, where you learn it by ear and you play it back by ear, as compared to playing from memory, where you learn it from notation, take the notation away and play it from memory. So I was interested in these creative oral and visual aspects of playing and how they may interact. And so one of my latest articles in the Oxford Handbook of Music Performance, where we talk about playing by ear, I started to try and compare and contrast what's going on with each of those skills in terms of ear-hand coordination skills, the reliance on the notation, reliance on the ear, the creative emphasis as compared to a more visual emphasis, etc. So that was the basis of that chapter. But this is my PhD, or one tiny little part of my PhD. And I did a path analysis of all these 5 skills and how they may interact. But I did extensive interviews with the children and their teachers and parents, etc. And we looked at, the length of study, how many lessons have they had, how much practice are they doing, etc., etc. The early exposure, what were they doing in the very, very earliest experiences of music, and what was the home environment like for them. And we looked at, and we looked at the interaction between, for example, early exposure and playing by ear and improvising. The oral side was very much influenced by, the type of early exposure to music, whether they started by ear or with notation. And the length of study obviously predicted the sight reading and performing rehearsed music. But look, there's a really strong path between playing by ear and sight reading. This traditional thing that kids who learn in the Suzuki technique, for example, they never really learn to read musical notation properly. Well, none of my research and the stuff that I've seen from others has sort of shown that there's any validity whatsoever to that. So some interesting connections that sort of contradict or complement or even expand our thinking in terms of music education. So I was blessed to go to a conference, ISME Research Commission conference. I think it was in Tampa in Florida, Miami in Florida in 1994. And I gave my presentation on my PhD, and Jane Davidson 1 hour later got up and gave virtually the same presentation with the same ideas and themes, etc., but with a study that she'd done with John Sloboda and Michael Howe. And so we got our heads together and we put together an Australian Research Council grant, and we got that in 1996. And we studied a group of children in 8 different school music programs, from, you know, fairly impoverished school music program, but it was there, through to some of the best school music programs in the country. These were young children, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 years of age. And we watched them. I worked with each child for 5 years, a number of times each year. We'd have 90-minute sessions with them. We had research assistants who would phone the parents and map out how much practice they were doing. Some of the parents were taking videotapes of the kids practicing at home. We did the classroom teachers, the instrumental teachers. We had their school academic results, etc., etc. So we had a massive data that we collected. And then we came back after about 10 years and 14 years, and we sort of see what these students were doing, because they were in their late 20s at that stage. And we wrote a book, which I think is the next slide. Yep. Music in Our Lives, Rethinking Musical Ability, Development and Identity. And that's really based on this study that went for about 14 years of these children from before they got their instrument, their first formal music lesson on the instrument, which is a week or two before they got the instrument, right through to well after they'd left school, and they were in, you know, their late 20s, early 30s, starting to get married and, you know, sort of offer music education to their children as well. Okay, so what were we doing? Well, in my PhD and that study, we were using self-regulated learning as a model. So some of the questions that we're interested in is, why does a child learn music? What is the motive behind this? And you can see the basis of self-regulation is vicarious or direct reinforcement by others. The external environment impacts the child, and they become able to self-set goals, self-reinforcement and self-efficacy. They start to feel that they can do it themselves. So it's this social to internal, social to internal. For each of these processes, we're interested in the method. When they sit down and practice, what are they doing? How much time do they devote to their practice? Is it, you know, how do they plan their time? When they're sitting down and doing it, what are they doing in terms of their behaviour? Is their performance socially monitored and evaluated? Like, are the parents around while they're practicing? Are there others in the room? Some kids have the television going full blast and they're watching television while they're practicing, right? Through to other children who'll go up to their bedroom and practice the flute by themselves in a corner of the room in isolation from other sorts of extraneous influences. Where the physical environment, again, you know, we had kids sort of practicing outside in the kitchen with mum making dinner, sort of in their bedroom. Every time we looked at them, they were, you know, somewhere else. Whereas other kids for five years practiced in exactly the same spot with exactly the same sort of setup. So we're interested in those the physical environment as well, and social. You know, one of perhaps the most important one. Where are they getting the help? You know, is the parent coming in and making comments to them about, you know, they love that piece, can you play it again? Or could you do this? And their teacher, for example, or is it sort of more isolating for them? Yeah. Now, as I said, I made the comment that, you know, we think of skill development, people just get better and better and better. How can someone learn trumpet and be worse at trumpet after a year than when they started? Is that possible? Or in third year, could they be worse than what they were in second year? Well, you can see from these results, some of the kids were. Now again, let me stress, the schools that we chose have got very, very good instrumental music programs. Some of them weren't the greatest, but the top ones, the top 4, were, you know, the best in Australia, or some of the best in Australia, and I would say that they'd be equal to anything representative anywhere else in the world. So there were quality programs at the top end. But you can see in the first year, when we had the performing rehearsed music tests, we had a 20-point scale from 0 to 10, 0, 0.5, 1, 1.5, etc. And the mean was 5. In year 3, we had some children who were not even scoring the mean of the first year, right? So these enormous differences that that occur immediately after learning starts. So you get the same thing in literacy in schools. You know, kids' reading ability, etc. You start to see huge differences in kids. So that's why we've got so many interventions very early on to sort of try and correct that. Sight reading, again, here the mean was 15. Some kids couldn't score anything in sight reading. They just, couldn't do it. But yet they could play in the ensemble. They could learn the pieces because it was more rote learning and, they're just copying other people rather than actually processing the notation. And the same, I have no idea how someone can learn an instrument for 3 years and still score 0 in sight reading after the third year of learning and still be playing, but that's what we found. So we compared, because they were doing essentially the same tests each year, and these were cumulative, so you could keep going. We'd stop them when they couldn't do any more. So, it was sort of, there wasn't an end to it, so they were cumulative. But here's the differences in scores from year 1 to 2. And you can see that in performing and rehearsed music, virtually all the kids got better between year 1 and 2. But that's not necessarily the case in some of these oral and creative skills. Why? Because they're not essentially doing much improvising in their learning. So they're not using it, so they lose it. And then here's the difference between year 2 and 3, and becomes even more profound. Sort of how can, approaching 35–40% of the children be worse at improvising in year 3 than they were in year 2. And that's exactly what we found. But again, most of the kids in the traditional way we think about skill development, which is performing and rehearsed music and sight reading, they were actually getting better. Yeah. Okay, so to frame all of this, at the time I was very interested in expectancy value motivation theory by Eccles and Wigfield. And that was one of the predominant ways of thinking about motivation. That, and it's a very simple sort of framework. If you expect to be good at something, then you're usually pretty good at it. And if you like doing it, if you value it, then you'll choose to do it. So incredibly simple framework. But one of the questions I asked in the first day I was doing my study, now this is a week before the children got their instrument. So they hadn't got their trombone or trumpet or violin or whatever it was yet. It was a week before they got their instrument. And I just happened to make a comment to the first boy who came in. And I was talking to him and I said, when you get your trombone next week, how long do you think you're going to play? And he gave me this amazing answer. And so I rushed out, sort of took notes on it, and I rushed out to my research assistants, which were the students at the university, who were helping me collect the data and do these interviews with the kids as well. And we added that question in 3 different ways onto what we had in the 60 or 70 questions we were going to ask these kids anyway. And so I don't know how this came out so cleanly, but sort of, seriously, this sort of is mind-boggling in a sense, because we mapped out how much, their achievement after a year of learning. We gave the kids the Watkins-Farnham Performance Scale, which is essentially an achievement test. It's a sight reading test, but it's, we use it to map out musical achievement. We looked at the parents' indications of how much practice the kid was doing, and we categorised them into low, medium and high. And then we asked the kid, how long do you think you're going to play your instrument before they start their instrument? Some kids would say, I'm just going to try this in primary school, just see how I go for a year or two. I'm doing ballet too, or just figure out what I'm going to do. They were the low-term commitment, or short-term commitment. Medium-term commitment was, I'll play this till the end of high school, but, when I leave high school and get a job, or I'm going to go to university, I don't think I'll have time to practice my flute. So that was medium-term commitment. Long-term commitment was, I'm learning flute, but I'd like to play this all my life. So there were 3 distinct categories that we could lump their comments into. And you can see that if you've got short-term commitment, it didn't matter whether they were doing low or high or medium amounts of practice, their skill level after 1 year was about the same. The ones who really flourished were the ones who had long-term commitment coupled with high amounts of practice. So it sort of gives us a sense of, what's happening before they even start and some of the motivational influences. Yeah. So one of the other studies I've done is a study with 50 of the most profoundly gifted and involved students I could find in the state of Illinois. and when I was teaching at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. So I did all the section leaders from the Chicago Youth Symphony. I did another 4 boys who are about 16 years of age. They just won the Battle of the Bands. At 16, they were commercial recording artists. They were doing amazing things, radio jingles and television commercials. They were getting a lot of professional gigs, even at 16. So I was interested in these highly involved children. And here's an interview with a 17-year-old flute player from Chicago. And you can see the 2 colour codings, the white where she's talking about herself, yellow where she's talking and reflecting about her mother and her mother's influence. And you can see this contradiction between her passion for music and these niggling self-doubts that she's getting from her mum. I remember my sophomore year of high school, I started thinking about applying to music schools. My mum said, you'd be just as happy being an English major or a history major, and you'd be much more secure. I was like, okay, that's fine. I still don't know what to do. I'm still applying to music schools, but it's hard to make a choice, and I don't want to make a choice. My mum is supportive but worried. I think she just wants me to be happy. She likes security. She's worried that I won't have a secure position or my life will be sort of all over the place. She hates that. I'd love to play in a great orchestra, but there is an opening once every 7 years and thousands of people are trying for that one shot. You have to move somewhere. My mum made me promise that I won't leave Chicago. She left her parents and she doesn't want me to do the same to her. I can always break my promise, but I would like to have options. And I think in music you are very much bound to who wants you and if they will, whether they will have you. So again, look, let me frame this. This girl, she was first flute in the Chicago Youth Symphony. She was playing in 5 ensembles, doing about 18 to 24 hours practice a week. She was doing enormous amounts of practice, 3 or 4 hours practice a day. I guarantee that if she went for some orchestral positions, she would get the position when she was about 17. That's how good this girl was. She was a phenomenal flute player. Okay, next slide. Well, I mapped her for about 3 or 4 years, and she went to the University of Michigan, and she did a double major in music and English, okay, to keep her mum happy, etc., etc. That's the same old story. And then in one of the interviews, she says, I'm considering dropping English because I have since discovered that it is unrewarding and unsatisfying. And then I said, okay, what are you going to be doing in 10 years' time, though? What are you going to be doing? I'm still not entirely sure that I will become a professional musician, but for now, it makes me happy. This is one of the best musicians I've ever interviewed, young musicians, and this contradiction is so stark. So for many highly involved students, there's this contradiction between their current musical identity and their future musical identity. And that sort of feeds into this expectancy value motivation theory. And in a couple of the chapters that I've written, I say that students who succeed are those who can imagine themselves as musicians into the future. Just think about that for a moment. If you can't imagine yourself into the future, then there's almost no chance you're going to succeed. When I grew up, Herb Albert was all over the radio and television. It was hit songs in Australian TV, and Richard will know. John Law's program would start with Herb Albert theme, and then he'd come in on his famous voice and do the talkback show for between 8 and 10 o'clock every morning. So I heard that every morning. Every time I went to breakfast, I heard Herb Albert introducing John Laws, who was this famous radio announcer. So the images were there. But when I taught my children trumpet, my 2 boys, their only image of trumpet really was me and maybe the other kids learning trumpet. They don't see it so much on television. They don't hear it so much on radio. The symbols aren't so much there. So I think it really is important for teachers to sort of give the sense, convey a sense of, look, this journey is going to take you somewhere, and this is what the possibilities are. That's really important for music teachers to do, and quite often they don't do it. I'm trying to not trying to give cues to you. No. Oh well, it was a good try. Okay, now about 2004, I became very interested in self-determination theory. And I don't know Edward Deasy, but I do know Richard Ryan, and he's the most amazing person I've ever met. He's such an amazing researcher and just such an incredibly generous person. But self-determination theory really contrasts intrinsic motivation with extrinsic motivation. And intrinsic motivation is doing an activity for its inherent satisfaction rather than for some separable consequence, because someone else is telling you to do it, for example. And extrinsic motivation, undertaking an activity in order to attain some separable outcome. Okay, how am I going with time? So, whoops. I put my watch over there and then I put it back on again. So, okay. Okay, right. Yeah, the next slide. And humans are inherently oriented towards growth and well-being, and we tend to thrive when we feel in control. Now, that's really critical. We thrive in situations when we feel we're in control and we can make choices. And our motivation decreases when others make choices for us and we feel we don't have control. And that occurs even with young children learning a musical instrument. Yep, next slide. And here's the whole theory. I mean, it's fairly detailed, but I'll start with the middle part of the theory, those 6 levels of motivation, from amotivation to intrinsic motivation. Then I'm going to go quickly onto the basic psychological needs. So let's go to the next slide. And again, we're focusing there. And what I'm going to do is give you an example of how each of these play out in terms of kid, practicing or being encouraged to practice. So let's start with amotivation. Yep. So amotivation, the child has no desire to play or practice music. It's almost anything you do, you're not going to turn them around. They're almost impossible to change. And we very rarely get that. Okay, external motivation is the next level up. And the child will practice, but only when told to practice or forced to practice. Now think for a sec. Look, if you've got a little grade 2 or 3 child with 6 or 7 years of age, you ask that child at school, look, is it important to do your homework? And the child say, yeah, it's important to do the homework because I might get better if I don't do my homework. And then you say okay, well, whose responsibility is to ensure that you do it? Oh, mum. If mum doesn't remind me, I don't need to do it. So you get this really interesting contradiction very early on. And it's sort of like, what's playing out there. And we find that exactly the same thing in music. Very young children need to be not coerced or pushed into practicing, but encouraged to practice. Next one. It's introjected, and the child will practice when reminded, so a little bit more gentle. Yep. And then identified as where the child will practice because they feel it's important. They recognise the value of learning. The integrated is where the child will practice because they feel that it's part of their identity. They start to feel, I'm a pianist or I'm a trumpet player, and this is part of what I do. And then the last one is the intrinsic motivation, where the child practices because they love making music and it makes them feel really good. Okay, so almost nothing's going to stop them from doing it. They're just going to do it. Now, very rarely do any of us reach that. We sort of sometimes get there for a little while and then we fall out of it. We fall back to the second or third level behind it to the left. And so, the next slide too. What we're trying to do as teachers and what we're trying to do as researchers is find techniques to get the children from the left more so to the right. Now, what are the ingredients of making that possible? Okay, well, I think the ingredients are basically the psychological needs. Now, researchers, DC and Ryan and hundreds of other people have tried to find a 4th or a 5th psychological need, but they keep coming back to these 3 basic psychological needs. They seem to be incredibly robust. The need for autonomy, for choice, and remember the comments I made just a moment about a choice. You need to feel in control that you've got choices and you can make decisions for yourself. The need to feel competent. I mean, you don't do anything. We don't do anything in our lives if we don't feel that we can be good at it or competent and display our mastery of certain things, even the little things. And relatedness, our connection with others, because music especially is a social experience. Okay, so autonomy, competence and relatedness feed into intrinsic motivation. Yep. And I'd like to discuss a study by Elisa Coopers, who came down to Melbourne to work with me for about 6 months, and I helped her with a PhD, and she set up this really beautiful, clean design, and I think a really powerful PhD that she did And essentially she was looking at Suzuki lessons with young children learning instruments, string instruments. And she was looking at these little children. She was looking at what the teacher says and how the child reacts, and what the child says and how the teacher reacts. So it was a really intense analyses of everything that was going on in the lesson, particularly in terms of how, go back a slide, particularly in terms of how engaged the child was, how focused the child was in the lesson, and how much autonomy or choice they were given. And you can see these, 4 things. Mimicry is where they're just being told what to do and they just do it, right? Absent low autonomy and low engagement, you don't really see much. And sometimes you do see resistance. So there's low engagement because the kids, little kids particularly, they're talking about other things. And she's got a beautiful example of a little girl who was saying, "Mum's going to take me to the fair tomorrow," and she couldn't get her to focus on the cello lesson because she wanted to talk about what Mum was going to do with her and, this experience she was going to have the next day. But the sweet spot is the autonomous engagement. High engagement also followed with high autonomy, so an autonomy supportive environment provided by the teacher. Now that's the sort of analysis that Elisa did. I mean, that's just a tiny little snapshot of a couple of seconds within these lessons, and so she coded everything. It was just a really wonderful analysis with multiple students. Yep. And this is what she found. She found that in the teaching process, high autonomy support triggered engagement. So when the teacher encourages the child to make decisions and give their perspective or their view, it triggers engagement. Low autonomy support, when they're just told what to do relentlessly, it triggers resistance or less engagement. An authoritarian style of teaching triggers mimicry and less meaningful interactions between the teacher and the student. And the authoritative style of teaching, where you give children choices, etc., that triggers engagement, curiosity, persistence, and more positive values about learning music. And you can look at all the literature. I've just given a couple of examples there, but look, there's hundreds of variables. There's virtually hundreds and hundreds of studies now on how autonomy supportive environments encourage children, they foster them, they allow them to realise their full potential, for example. And so, an autonomy supportive environment, the kids have got less frustration, less feelings of helplessness, less negative feelings, they're less self-critical of themselves, less negative thoughts. I could go on and on and on. The literature's out there, it's profound, but we don't really see it much in lessons, in music or even in classroom lessons. Yep, next slide. Now, I don't know, put your hand up if you know Bob Valleran's work in Canada. Okay, so this is a new slide. Well, this is my sort of summarisation of some of his articles. Now, these have been done with music students in Canada, students who are learning instruments, for example, and many, many hundreds of them. And he talks about children who are highly involved in music or any activity, for example, and there's 2 profiles. You can have harmonious passion or obsessive passion. Now, harmonious passion is where it's driven by yourself. You want to do this. You feel intrinsically motivated. You're encouraged to make decisions for yourself, for example. You're exposed to an autonomy supportive teaching environment. And you can see that there's a positive relationship between autonomy support, harmonious passion, and then persistence. When these kids have problems or hit obstacles or bad experiences, they're more likely to persist afterwards. Obsessive passion is more psychological control. They feel they're doing it because the teacher, not forcing them but pushing them to do it, or their parents, the parents are paying money for the lessons, whatever it is. So there's extrinsic influences that are undermining their harmonious passion, which plays out as a form of obsessive passion. And that leads to stress, and they're the children who are less likely to persist. That's a negative relationship between stress and persistence. So when they have obstacles, bad experiences, they're less likely to want to continue. Okay, the person who does the most work and the most amazing work in this area is John Marshall Reeve. He's got a new book out with Richard Ryan just very recently, and if you're interested in autonomy supportive environments, go to John Marshall Reeve, because he's got this amazing research plus really good practical ideas. Next slide. Now, how am I going? Yeah, I'm sort of almost there. I've got about 20 minutes of slides. I'll try and condense them into 10. Okay, so the other influence that I've had is John Hattie. Now, he works at my University of Melbourne, and he's a world authority on visible learning theory, which is used in many, many school systems around the world. And I just like the idea, and I've tried to adapt this for music in some publications that I've written with John, including one that's in the Oxford Handbook of Music Performance that we did recently. Okay, now the main ingredients of this visible learning theory is that we're making learning visible to the child. They understand how they're learning and in which ways they're learning. But we do that by seeing learning as seen as a journey. So pointing out to kids that, you couldn't do this 2 weeks ago, but you can do it now. And this is what you've got to do. Let's see if we can aim for this in a couple of weeks' time. And think about this. In most lessons, we don't sort of point out the journey to the kids. They don't perceive their development like we can see as a teacher, right? It's obvious to us that they couldn't do that last week, but they can do it this week. But for young children in particular, that's not always the case. They're not always aware that they couldn't do it last week or that they've improved to a certain extent this week. So point out that the learning, make it visible to them. And development is seen as having reached a particular point along that journey. So yeah, we'll just flick through a couple more. Next one. Yep, next one. And so you can see that sort of, that's John's way of thinking about visible learning. It's about goal setting. It's about achieving your personal best. How well can I perform next week? And have I improved from last week? It's sort of seeing this as a visible journey. Yep, next one. And so an integral part of this theory is feedback, the sort of relationships that teachers have with their students during the lesson. So let's look at feedback. I could sort of make comments that are essentially about what the child just did. So that we call that feedback, reflection. How did you just go? So I make a comment, you played an F sharp instead of an F natural, or you need to play that faster or louder or whatever it is, or you made a mistake there. Can you do it again? That's feedback. It's a commentary on what's happened. Now the problem with feedback is quite often it's seen as criticism. It's endless criticism that the child perceives, okay? So you're just telling them what they did wrong. And, intermediate and advanced level kids, they know what they did wrong. You don't need to necessarily tell them. The next one is feed forward. And feed forward is where we're looking at the future. Okay, the teacher thinks, yeah, you did that wrong, but then explains to the child, why don't you try it this way? I have the same problem, but sort of why don't you use this strategy instead? So you're focusing on the next performance rather than the previous performance of what they've just done. So it's feed forward is about the future, where to next strategies, and then the feed up is goal setting, where are we going? And I'll tell you some results in a moment with some leading teachers, instrumental teachers at one of the best music schools in the world. And I was surprised that there wasn't a lot more of this, that the showing or demonstrating to the student what the goal was for achieving a peak performance on an aspect of a piece that they were learning. So next one. So that's the theory: feed back, feed forward, and feed up. Now, we've just published an article in the Journal of Research in Music Education, and as I said, we worked with 6 highly expert instrumental teachers in one of the world's best music schools. And these teachers are the type of teachers whose students actively, from all around the world, would choose to go there to study with. So they're really fabulous teachers. The other one we're just about to publish, or will publish in the next 12 months, is a study with pianists in Australia who are at the beginning and intermediate levels of development. We've sort of done extensive, there's about 80 or 100 hours of coding of lessons from these young pianists at the beginning and intermediate stages of development, and we're using the same framework. Okay, so when you code this, you can look at the type of feedback, feed up, feed forward, so you can code the type, but you can also code the level. Is the comment about the task? Is the comment about the process? Is the comment about self-regulation? What do you think? What were you thinking when you're doing this? Okay, so self-monitoring. Or is it a comment about self? You're fantastic at that. That's really great. It's the worst thing you can say to a kid. Okay, if you want to kill motivation, that's the sort of thing that you say to a kid, which a lot of teachers do. Why? Because it reinforces perceptions of ability. It's ability rather than, effort. And there's a wonderful study by Bob Duke at University of Texas, and he talks about the difference, and this is by studying really great teachers, the difference between constant praise, which is sort of after a while just flies over a kid's head and has no meaning or value to a lesson, as compared to intense praise. So stopping once or twice in a lesson and just celebrating what the kid could do that they couldn't do before. And kids thrive when you teach in that way, because they want praise, and they'll sort of really start to be more engaged, more focused to get that praise. So when you do the praise, intense praise rather than constant praise. So, but anyways, look, self has no effect on learning. So it's these other things that we're really interested in. Yep, next one. So here's the 6 instrumental teachers. So here's the basic results of the percentages of the amount of feedback. So the amount of feedback by these 6 teachers and the lessons that we did was 83% of the time was feedback. Okay, next one. And most of the comments were about the task, what the child just did. So that was 85% of the time. Yep. And you can see that there's different profiles, up here. My zipper was sort of starting to wear out. Feedback task, feedback process, feedback self-regulation, etc., then feed up, etc., etc. You can see that there's slight differences between a lot of the teachers, or the teachers that we analysed, but not major differences. Like this one here was a violin teacher, and virtually everything that occurred in the lesson for those 6 lessons that we observed was feedback task. You did that wrong, let's do it again. No, that was wrong. So it was seen by the student, I'm sure, as endless criticism. Yep. Here's the other 3 teachers. Oh, sorry, that was the one I wanted to mention, the violin teacher there. Oh, sorry, no, I've got the wrong one. It's the previous one. Anyway, you can see the results are sort of a little bit scattered, and not too many of them were, giving an indication of feed up, which is the goal. Yep. Okay, I'm going to wrap up. I'm told to wrap up. So here we go. Let's skip that slide. Yeah, let's get rid of that slide, and I'll just quickly move on to the last part. Okay, let me take over here. Self-regulation. Okay, the ingredients of self-regulation: 2 things: before, during, and after, and cognition, what you're thinking; behaviour, what you're doing; and affect, what you're feeling. So they're the 2 components of self-regulation. And I won't do this in any detail, but you can see that the forethought, there's 2 different things happening. They've got the task analysis and the self-motivational beliefs, and all these attributes that sort of play out before you do something. And then you've got the performance phase, where you've got the impact on the performance, the self-instruction and self-observation while you're doing something. And then you've got the self-reflection, your self-judgments when you judge what you've just particularly done and how you react to that. Now, we did a study with, done a number of studies. I'll do this really quickly. I want to focus on 2 things: task strategies and self-efficacy. And here's the one that we did with those students in the 8 schools in the Australian programs. And we're looking at the amount of practice that the students accumulated over a year, and their strategy use when they were playing by ear, when they were sight reading, when they were improvising, playing from memory, and playing performed or rehearsed music. And you can see for the visual skills that practice and strategy explained their skill, but for the oral and creative skills, practice didn't explain the skill or contribute to understanding of the skill. It was really about the strategy. And here's one for sight reading. So we were mapping out or categorising these levels of task strategy, the sophistication of what they're doing and thinking in their mind as they're doing these tasks. And you can see in this one here that you can see the results for year 1, 2, and 3 in the blue, red, and green lines, and the score on the left-hand side for the sight reading measure. You can see there's a really close association between the strategy and the level of skill. So it didn't matter whether they were in year 1, 2 and 3. If you knew their strategy, then you could predict what the level of skill was. And here's this one's a bit scary actually because it's so close with playing by ear. If they're using strategy through 3, I could say that their scores are probably going to be between such and such and such and such, no matter whether they were learning 1 year, 2 years or 3 years. Okay, self-efficacy is the other one. Can versus I can't do it. We found here that, which is one of my most cited studies, is self-efficacy explained performance more so than formal practice for an externally graded examination with about 700 or 900 students. We did that over 2 studies. And then we did another study where we got students at our university music program who were doing a Bachelor of Music in Performance to fill out a diary. We videotaped their practice, gave them interviews before and after the practice session. And just very, very basically, what we found is 2 types of students. We found students who we called proactive, so they think about what they're going to do. They set themselves some goals for the practice session. They're thinking about it in the hour or 2 before they do the practice, then they go in and do it. As compared to the reactive students who rely, they just basically go into the practice room and start thinking, oh, what will I do at the time of doing it? And then afterwards, quite often they feel, oh, that wasn't a great practice session, I didn't achieve much, etc., etc. So, I'll miss that one. So, that's some really interesting stuff there with the microanalysis technique that we've been using. That's pretty common now in academic learning, but we've been introducing or trying to introduce that into music to sort of see if we can make learning more visible for students at all levels, particularly university level students, and optimise their performance as much as we can so that they take more control of their learning. They're more self-determined, they're more self-regulated. I've gone over time. Thanks. Any questions?
Well, the microphone is with you. Well, thank you very much. So much to tell, so much was researched here. So we could start with the questions, perhaps. Are you?
Yeah, I've got to find a way of getting, get out of that.
They're here. Just okay, let's make, we have 14 messages in chat. Questions, let's do a bit first on in-person questions and then...
Any questions? It was like a strobe, wasn't it? It was so quick that even I didn't understand it. So
how many was proactive and reactive?
it was about, well, these are students in the Bachelor of Music doing piano performance as their major instrument, right? So they're already quite gifted musicians, but we found a majority were reactive. They've just come from a lesson or a lecture and they go straight into the practice room and, oh, what am I going to do today? And they go through routines, it's habits, right? So their practice is, basically inefficient. There might be times when they're more proactive, on the weekend when they've got a little bit more time to think about it. But the other ones were much more strategic. They'd finish a practice session and, okay, tomorrow I've got to work on. They'd have in their mind an idea of what they need to work on in the next couple of days. This is the thing I can't do. And they see their journey, I could show you some of the results with self-efficacy and stuff where they predict, in the first week of learning a new piece, some of them are saying, well, I'll learn this in 2 weeks or 3 weeks. But the realistic ones, the proactive ones were, much more guarded. Okay, I've got to get this by week 10 of the semester. I've got to be able to play it from memory and, without any mistakes. But I don't need to get it this week or next week. But this week I'm going to work on this. Next week I'm going to work on that. We had some students who were incredibly deliberate with their practice versus the majority who weren't.
Thank you for, is it working or not? Mama? No. I'm just going to be loud then.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for totally inspiring presentation. And I was just wondering, you're emphasizing the importance of strategic feedback. But how do you reflect on
It's about language, and that's why I like John Marshall Reeves' work. So with the students, if you see me work with my students, it's a, sort of, I get them to teach each other, and then we talk about language. Why did you say that? Why don't you say this? My wife is a primary school music teacher, and she picked me up one time because I was giving a demonstration, I was talking about something, and you could say to a kid, by next week I want you to be able to do this, as compared to, next week do you think you could do this? Which is completely different. The word in the English language that I love more than anything else is the word yet. Every time a kid says to you, I can't do this yet, I don't like this piece yet. It just changes them from a fixed mindset to a growth mindset. Now that's simplistic, but what we're trying to do now is reinterpret some of the extensive literature in educational psychology, particularly John Marshall Reeve, and use that in to retrain, to reprogram music teachers, because we all do it. I do it, right? So we've got to learn. It's just tiny little tweaks to our language can change the whole context from authoritarian to authoritative. But the main ingredient is give kids choice. Just don't tell them. Look, can I, really quickly, if a kid comes in for a trumpet lesson with me and I say, that's fantastic, really, really good, I'm going to give you these 2 pieces for next week. Kid comes in, plays those 2 pieces. Wow, you're really good. I'm going to give you 3 this week, right? It's all telling them. Very soon they sort of cotton on to think, well, if I learn these 3, he's going to just give me another 3. So there's no choice there. There's no autonomy. So it needs to be negotiated. For me, out of everything I've said and everything I've studied, autonomy is the thing we've got to work on. And it's so simple if we use the right language.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Maybe without microphone or... It doesn't work. Okay.
Just loud.
Thank you so much. First, I'd like to thank you. It was a very interesting presentation. And as a non-professional musician who has played years of instrument, of piano playing, I was able to identify almost on every slide when you talked, which is really, really cool. And I just wanted to ask you this question, because you talked about how much classical music education puts effort into educating children into reading music and rehearsing, and not so much on ear training and thinking in sound, which is something I'm really, really interested in. And I just wanted to ask you, do you have any recommendations for literature on and strategies for how we should teach Western music, which is very, very connected to notation, with strategies that are connected to thinking in sound rather than thinking in notes and rehearsal? Thank you very much.
I think we're still learning how to do this, to be honest, if I was really honest. Lucy Green has done some amazing work in the UK, and a number of her PhD students have put out some wonderful literature on this, because her husband was a pop musician, and so she's got these books out on how popular musicians learn, etc. And I've been influenced by James Mannering and stuff. So if you saw me teach, the younger the child is, the more time I would spend on ear to hand coordination skills. The eye wouldn't be involved in terms of literacy. We've known for studies, for example, since the 60s and 70s, where we get kids to invent their own notation and then lead on to traditional notation. That sticks, makes it more relevant to them than sort of going straight into traditional notation. We've got to pick up on some of these ideas. It's tricky, it's hard, because we've got a half-hour lesson with a kid each week, and you've got a revolving door with all these kids coming through with a lesson. So this is not easy. And I'm not suggesting for 1 second that it is, but if you saw me, I used to teach at my son's primary school for 9 years, because there was hardly a music program there, and I used to take the ensemble 3 mornings a week before school started. And I used to come in and quite often, 7:30 in the morning, the kids are still waking up, they're sloppy, they're talking to each other. I'd scream at them, get their instruments out so we can practice. And then after a while, I just sort of got my instrument out and just start playing little call and response exercises. So we'd always spend the first 5 or 10 minutes of a lesson, just some call and response things, and I'd, just point to someone, or they would point to each other, and they'd improvise, and we'd copy them, etc. So I'm not saying that this takes over a lesson, but as long as it's a few minutes of every lesson. So my theory, my advocacy would be, in all lessons, try and do some of the visual orientation, the oral orientation, and the creative orientation. That's why I was interested in those 5 skills, okay? Because I was a classically trained musician, and I just found that it was more fun when I did that, and the kids enjoyed it too. But that's me. Everyone's got to find their own template for doing this. Doesn't happen. It doesn't work with everyone. Yeah, up the back.
We have time for 2 questions.
Okay.
More.
And is there any on the chat?
Not relevant for discussion.
Sorry?
Forget it. The messages from the
Oh, okay.
are not relevant.
Okay, so
They're more technical.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. I'm Canadian, so I really want to get those references from you. My question is, the most important thing I saw was the downward trajectory of the incoming students who came with a certain amount of skill and probably love, who actually didn't advance or actually did worse, which makes complete sense to me. It happened to my own daughter. She got in on a full scholarship and failed first year. But my question is, did you account for any learning issues, anxiety issues? Because a lot of time kids come in and cannot submit to the system. They don't have the same skills that they learned by ear when they came in. They can't always do that within the system. And the teachers also can't accommodate for, or don't know how to accommodate for those. I wondered if you had factored in anxiety, learning anxieties, learning issues, and some of those things in your study.
and we have a number of case studies in the Music in Our Lives book where we discuss that. I mean, look, the 2 points about that study in particular. The first one is that we see huge discrepancies in skill after a few weeks and months of learning, right? Now, in any other area of learning, teachers would be onto that. The kids would be pulled out of class because they've got a reading deficit, they're given one-to-one training, etc. We've got to learn to get onto the problems earlier, particularly when we're teaching group situations or school situations. The other one is that sort of quite often we're not aware of what's happening in the kid's life. So, just sort of, and it's hard. This is ethically very, very difficult. We had 9 parents who separated in this study in the first 18 months or 2 years, because, which is really a shame. 160 families and 9 of them separated. Now, almost immediately, the kid would be, practicing above the average, bang, they wouldn't be doing any practice. Some of them would get going again, but all 9 eventually quit. So that was something we didn't know about, because it just came up after the event when we were doing the exit interviews with the kids. So there's all these personal issues beyond learning challenges that sort of, this is the complexity of teaching. We're not miracle workers. We can't succeed with every kid. We can't solve all the world's problems. But sort of, we've got, when we're aware of it, we can accommodate. And, look, can I just finish with one thing? The worst kid I ever taught was a little girl who played trumpet with my 2 sons who gave her hell sitting in the trumpet section. She wanted to learn trumpet, and I used to give her private lessons and et cetera, et cetera. For me, she went nowhere over the 3 years that I taught her. But she was there. She was the first kid at the lesson every time. Then she went to high school and sort of, I saw the mum uptown when she was in year 9 or 10. I said, how's Judy going these days? Oh, she's still doing music. She's, still playing the trumpet, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm thinking, oh my God, what's going on here? And then, 2 years later, I saw the mum quite often. But, by the end of year 12, she was singing professionally, and she's a professional musician. She's a singer. So I had no idea that journey was going to take her on that route, because she certainly, I struggled to sort of get through to her and help her on trumpet, but she obviously loved music. So that sort of, for me, just puts my feet on the ground about, you can't tell. Some of these kids would go backwards for 6 months and then all of a sudden they'd take off again. You know, you've got to get them through that period. Kids with braces, for example. I mean, it's a lot better now because they've got, you know, but in those days they had those, you know, steel things where put the wax on their teeth, etc. You know, the challenges that the kids go through, we've got to be really, really patient with them. I've gone way too long, guys. I've got to finish. Thanks so much.
Look, now it's working.
But it worked okay. You were brilliant.
Yeah. Well, sorry that I couldn't pick you up.